All right, we are on page 8 today. Last week, the conference I was at, one of the speakers that they had was a missionary in Papua New Guinea. And as he was sharing what they did, I was thinking, that's exactly kind of what I'm trying, like through this study is the excitement, that we're trying to see the Bible as one story. And so he was sharing, they went to a people group, I think they were called the Imbe, if I remember correctly. But they decided they were going to reach this people group. They had a list of people that were asking for missionaries, and so they went down the list and saw there was one group that had been asking for a missionary for 12 years, and nobody had been able to go to them yet. And so they decided to try that group, but they couldn't get a plane into them, and so they went to the second group on the list that had been asking, and they flew a plane over the village, dropped a water bottle out, plastic water bottle with a note, and said, "We're coming to you today, please be kind." And so they dropped this note, and then they landed the plane and then spent 7 hours in a boat on the river getting to the village. And met the village, and the village was excited to have a missionary. And then I believe it was 4 families moved there and began to translate the Bible into their language and began to create a written language for them and teach them to read because they had no written language. And so as they translated the Bible, they started in Genesis and began to translate Genesis 1 and creation in Genesis 2. And as they would share the stories with them, they would act them out. And he said, now in their culture, when they like a story, they yell out, and I can't remember exactly what they say. Oh, it's something like "your words make my belly warm" or something like that. But they'll yell out and they scream during the story. They're like, "Yeah, keep going," type things. And then if they don't like your words, they say, "You're causing me to vomit your words." And so it's very, that's like the heart for them. Yeah, very graphic. And so they're talking about this is the culture, and this is the audience that they're sharing the story with. Well, they get to Genesis chapter 3, and the missionary that was sharing with us, he's got this black sheet on, and he's portraying Satan. And another missionary lady is portraying Eve, and so they're talking about the temptation of Eve, and people are yelling at her, "Don't eat the fruit!" And they're into it. And he says, and literally, as she reaches for it, people are jumping up and they're grabbing her arms and they're pulling on her and saying, "Don't eat the fruit." And she, of course, eats it, and it's dead silent. Because they understood what had happened, that she had disobeyed God. And so they keep going, and they get to Genesis 3:15 and the promise that one will come that will crush the head of Satan. So they go on, and they get to Cain and the birth of Cain. And so as they're telling that, somebody's like, wait, is this the one? Is he the one? And of course they have to say no. And as they teach through the Old Testament, as they go through every story, they said that somebody at some point would ask that question, is this the one? And because they're getting it all, they're getting it from Genesis, and they're just going through, and that is their huge question, is who is the one that was promised? And then of course as they go through and they finally get to Jesus, and somebody says, is this the one? And they get to say, yes, this is the one, and this is why we have moved here. And so I think that he said that about 50% of the village ended up becoming believers. And he goes back once a year and visits and everything. But I thought that's the story of the Bible. No matter where you're at in the Bible, that's the huge question, is who is the one that is providing the salvation that God promised back in Genesis 3. And so as we go through this study, I want us to see how all of the Bible is fitting together, and it's really just telling this one story of God's grace and God's goodness in salvation through Jesus Christ. Okay? So I want to share that with you because I was like, that's a cool story. So that's part of what I did last week. So where we're at is we were talking about the partial kingdom 2 weeks ago, and we talked about in the partial kingdom. So what, again, I want you to understand what we're talking about here is when God makes that promise that one will come and crush the head of Satan, he's promising that there will be a future kingdom. And so with the promise to Abraham, you have this promise given to him that they are going to be a people, they are going to have a land, and God fulfills promises to Abraham, but not in total. Like as things are fulfilled in Abraham and you see, okay, God now has his people, it's Abraham's line, but through that we're still left going, okay, but that's not the full promise fulfilled because something better is still coming. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay. And we're just using these terms to kind of help us put the Bible in sections. So last time we met together, we talked about the people and we talked about the partial fulfillment. And so you have Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Joseph's children, and how that is just, that's a motley crew. They are not people I would choose to build my nation on if I were building a nation, but because they're human and they're sinners and they're not perfect, but yet this is how God is building his people, is through this family. And we walked through that. And then we talked about how God saves them in Exodus. So as we went through God's people, we went through the end of Genesis. That's the story of God building his people, right? There at the end is you have those stories of all the patriarchs. And then we move into Exodus, and you're getting God's rescue of his people. So there God is rescuing his people for himself, not based on their worth, but just because he's got, and this is not in your notes. So I see some of you flipping pages here, but I want you to see like what part of the Bible we're talking about, because I realize I didn't put this in your notes, but I want you to see like when we talk about the partial fulfillment in God's people, we're talking about that Abraham, Genesis 12, really on into the beginning of Exodus where God rescues his people. Okay? And then partial fulfillment is going to go on, and we'll see more of that today. But so God's people are there. And then we talked about God's rule and blessing. And so a part of God's rule and blessing, again, is in Exodus, and it gets retold in Deuteronomy, but it's the giving of the law. Like that is a blessing to his people. And I love Deuteronomy chapter 4, because there's a statement in there whereas Moses is retelling them and reminding them of what they've learned, where he says to them, all the other nations look at you and are envious, this is my paraphrase, but are envious of you because you have a God that has spoken to you. You have a God that has told you what to do. Like that is a huge blessing from God to be able to be told, here is how you make me happy. Here's how you become right with me. Here is how we can have a relationship. And I always think of the showdown on Mount Carmel where you have the prophets of Baal, and they're crying out to their God, and they're cutting themselves, and they're screaming, and really they're guessing. They're guessing at what their God wants, and they're going to be wrong every time because he's not real. He has never spoken. But God has spoken. Yahweh has spoken. He's given the law. So the law is a partial fulfillment. It's God's rule and blessing where he says, this is what I want of you. And then he gives them the tabernacle. So they have a very real picture of God being with them. He is in their midst. He is in their presence. But even there, you still just have a partial fulfillment because God is here, he's in our midst, and they would camp around the outside, but there's still that separation. Like there's rules about the holy place and then the Holy of Holies. And so God is in us, he's in our nation, he's there in the middle in the tabernacle and eventually the temple, but we're still looking forward to what we will know in the future where God is not in a temple in Jerusalem. God's temple is in us. God dwells in us. And so that's the partial fulfillment, and we talked about that last week. And a statement I think is key is that obedience is a way of enjoying God's rule and blessing. I think that's just really key for us as Christians, that we understand that a way to enjoy God's rule and blessing is to do what he says. To obey him. And as we obey him, I really believe that our potential for joy grows. Like if I live in my sin, my joy's kind of here. And if sin didn't offer joy and pleasure and happiness, it wouldn't be a temptation, right? But if we sin, like there might be a little bit of happiness, but when we obey God, like the potential for our joy and happiness just explodes and is made, is multiplied. What's the little number? What do you call that when you put the little number? Exponentially. It is multiplied exponentially. Sabina's way smarter than me if you haven't figured that out yet. So, all right, so we talked about God's people, and we talked about God's rule and blessing. So that takes us through the end of Genesis and into Exodus. So today, let's talk about God's place. And I realize I have not given you a lot of room in your notes, but you should be on page 8, I believe. And let's talk about God's place. So in Genesis 12:7, God makes the promise, to your offspring I will give this land. And the people in Exodus are enjoying God's blessing and they're enjoying his presence, but they don't have the land yet. Okay, they haven't made it to Canaan yet. And so you get to the book of Numbers, and Numbers you could really title or give a subtitle to that book of disobedience and delay. That's really what's happening in the book of Numbers, is they're disobeying, and so they're being delayed. Like, it's not really a long trip from Egypt to Canaan. If you look at a map, it's really a very, very short distance. There's an express lane there. They could have gotten there very quickly, but they don't. And why? Because they disobey. So if you go to Numbers 14, verse 3, and you see their rebellion here. Numbers 14, verse 3, it says, "Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." And so you get this rebellion in their hearts, this doubting God's promises, and because of their doubt and because of their rebellion, they end up spending 40 years wandering the wilderness. And then listen to this verse. This is 1 Corinthians 10, verse 6. It says, "Now these things took place as an example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did." And if you read the first part of that, he's looking back to Numbers. And he's saying all of these things took place, and all of these things are recorded as an example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. My dad used to always say, a wise man learns from his mistakes, a wiser man learns from the mistakes of others. Right? I saw a friend jump off the roof, and I decided not to do that. I saw friends in high school chew Copenhagen, snuff, watched them throw up, and said, I'm not going to do that. and so as we have Numbers, like, we can look back and go, you know what? They disobeyed God, they complained, and it led to discipline. And they had to wander in the desert. And so the sooner we learn that, the better off we'll be. There's a pastor down south named David Hegg that wrote a book called The Obedience Option. And he defines faith in this way, and you may have heard me quote this before, but he says, faith is a life-dominating conviction that all God has for me through obedience is better than what the world offers through selfishness and sin. Do you get that? So faith is believing that what God offers through obedience, actually he says it's a life-dominating conviction that all God has for me through obedience is better by far than anything this world or Satan offers through selfishness and sin. That's a lesson we can learn from the Israelites in the book of Numbers, is that they didn't have that life-dominating conviction that what God said to them, what God promised them was better than what the world offers. And I think there's such a good lesson there because they look back at Egypt and they don't remember how bad it was. They don't remember their complaints. They don't remember their begging God to come save them. And then when he does and they get out in the wilderness and they disobey and they experience his discipline, they think, well, we should go back to Egypt because it was so good there. Well, no, it wasn't. And we see the same thing go on in our own hearts. And so Numbers is disobedience and delay. And then in the book of Deuteronomy, it's the book of blessings and curses. Blessings and curses. If you go to Deuteronomy chapter 28, you'll see an example of that. And so what's happening in the book of Deuteronomy is Moses is basically retelling them the stories that they already know. So I mentioned Deuteronomy chapter 4, and you're going to have the reminder of what happened at Mount Sinai. You have the giving of the law a second time in Deuteronomy. Not that it's occurring for a second time, but Moses is telling them, this is what happened. Do you remember what it was like to be at the mountain? Do you remember how terrifying it was to have God speak to you? Do you remember what a blessing it was to have God speak to you? Because he actually said, here's what I want. And then you get to chapter 28, and it lays out what happens if you faithfully obey God. So chapter 28, verse 1 says, and if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the field. Blessed shall you be the fruit of your womb, and the fruit of your ground, and the fruit of your cattle, the increase of your herds, and the young of your flock. Blessed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Blessed you shall be when you come in, and blessed shall you be when you go out. And then it goes on like that down through verse 14. But just blessed, blessed, blessed. If you obey, you're blessed. If you have a life-dominating conviction that what God has for you through obedience is good, you will be blessed as you obey him. And then you get to verse 15. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, and cursed shall you be in the field. Cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground, and the increase of your herds and the young of your flock. Cursed shall you be when you come in, and cursed shall you be when you go out, and on like that, just verse after verse after verse. And so again, you have this just written out in Deuteronomy that if we obey God, we find blessing, and when we disobey God, we find cursing. James puts it really, God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. So when we disobey God, we are putting ourselves in the place of the lawmaker, and we're saying, I don't like your law, I'm going to make my own law, and I'm going to do what I want to do. And so we're subverting his rule. And why would we expect God to bless us when we're undermining his rule? And so we get that in the book of Deuteronomy. You have blessings and curses. This is how they are supposed to live when they get to Canaan. When they get to the promised land, this is how they're supposed to do it. They're supposed to obey him. And then we get to the book of Joshua, and you have the conquest. So since we're in Joshua, go to Deuteronomy chapter 9. Deuteronomy chapter 9. And so one of the questions you have, is it unjust for the Israelites to be given this land? You hear that a lot, right? That who are these mean Israelites just coming and taking over? But one of the things we have to remember is there's a big picture of what's going on here. And a lot of times we forget that God is working in a macro level with things. And you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 4. He says, do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so the land of Canaan, it's not because the Israelites, again, are such great people that they're being gifted this land, but God, while he is blessing the Israelites and fulfilling his promise to give them a land, is also using them to judge the nations that are already there because of their wickedness. God does this a lot in the Old Testament, where he'll sometimes use an evil king to bless somebody, and sometimes he'll use an evil king to discipline somebody, to bring judgment on somebody. And so if you ever go and you hear, well, the God of the Old Testament was such a mean God because he just kicked those poor Canaanites out. Well, they weren't poor Canaanites. They were nations that had rejected God. And if you go back to Noah, and you have his family spread out, so as they get off the ark, they all know God. And then as they spread out over the earth, somewhere down the line, they deny God. And they choose not to obey him. They choose to worship something else, and they pass that on to their families. And then as you go through Genesis, you find out that God specifically tells some of the nations, I'm going to curse you because of this. And then Israel is used to do that. So in the book of Joshua, God is giving them the land. They're conquering the land. And then in Joshua 21, so you get to the end of Joshua 21, verse 43, we have this specific reminder that God is fulfilling his promise. Joshua 21:43 says, Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest. Did you catch that? Remember when we went back, we were talking about creation, like we're designed to, like God created the world so that we could live in rest. And rest is being in his place under his rule. Now, this is going to be a very short rest, but the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. And so everything that God promised to them, he gives to them. But yet it's not perfect, because they're not in the final land. They're not enjoying all of his blessing, but they are in his place. Okay? So we're defining God's kingdom is God's people in God's place and under his rule. Okay? Under his rule and blessing. And so you have, who are God's people? In this part of the Bible, the partial fulfillment, God's people are the Israelites, the nation of Israel, Abraham's descendants. And what is God's place? Canaan, right? The land of Israel, Canaan. They've been given. They're in his place. And they're enjoying his rule and blessing in that they've been given the commandments. They have the tabernacle. But during this time also, you have something else added to the rule and blessing. You have a specific promise of a king. And so the rule and blessing is now they realize that there is a king that is going to come to rule over them. And so, again, going back to Genesis 3:15, we have the promise that one will come and crush the head of Satan. And then in Genesis 49, I want you to see a couple specific verses, because I think I'd always been taught this, and I always believed that when Israel asked for a king, they were doing something wrong. They weren't. They had been promised a king. That's not where their heir was. The heir was in what type of king they wanted. So in Genesis 49, verse 10, Jacob is blessing his sons, and it says in verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So you're talking there about a scepter, and you're talking about a ruler's staff, and everybody paying tribute to this descendant. That's a king. He's saying there's a king that's going to come from Judah. And then you go to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy 17, verse 14. So remember, we're in Deuteronomy. The Saul thing hasn't come up yet. But in Deuteronomy 17, it says, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. And he shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver or gold. And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, approved by the Levitical priests. And it shall be with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, that he may learn to fear the Lord his God by keeping all the words of this law and these statutes and doing them, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brothers, and that he may not turn aside from the commandment, either to the right hand or to the left, so that he may continue long in his kingdom, he and his children in Israel. And so back in Deuteronomy, God gave them specific instructions regarding the king. And so they knew that one day they would have a king. But did you catch the key thing in there? There's a couple key things. So you could answer this in not the way I'm looking for, but still be right. Because there's a few key things. But who gets to pick the king? God. Yep. Where does it say that? Yeah, there you go. 15. You may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. So that they knew that goes back to that Genesis 3:15. There's that promise that king is going to come. And so as we think about God's king, we have that promise that the king will come, and then we get a partial fulfillment, right? We get kings, but they're not the king. And so Judges is a cycle of sin and grace. So we went through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Joshua is conquering, and then you get to Judges, and you have this cycle. There's sin, and then there's grace. There's sin, and then there's grace. And I will just tell you right now that Judges is a book of descriptions, not a book of prescriptions. Like, the book of Judges is just a messed up time in the history of Israel. Like, I loved the story of Samson as a child. Like, I just loved that story. You do not want to say to your son, be like Samson, right? I mean, it's like that. There's just all kinds of things going on that you're like, just, that's not good. But it's what God is doing through there. And so you have this cycle. The Israelites turn from God and they serve idols, and then a judge comes and sets things right. And these stories are happy. It's not always the entire nation of Israel. Sometimes it's a specific place within the nation. And so you have judges that are doing things in different parts of the nation. But during this entire book, that's the cycle. They disobey, God delivers them. They disobey, God judges them and delivers them. Okay? So that's what is happening. And God raises up judges or rulers who defeat the enemy and restore peace to the nation. And the judges are a sign of God's grace. They're not necessarily heroes to emulate, like I use Samson. Gideon is another one. Like, I loved the story of Gideon. And then you always think, oh, Gideon was such a humble guy because, they wanted to make him a king, and he says no. Except for then, if you keep reading in there, he ends up making for himself an ephod, and he ends up taking money from them, gold and that kind of thing. And then he names himself Abimelech, which means my father is king. Say, okay, Gideon didn't really end up, it's an amazing story, but it's an amazing story of God's grace using a sinful man. Again, we don't want to say be like Gideon. There are principles that you can go, hey, that's a good principle, but Gideon wasn't the greatest guy in the world either. And so you see this cycle through all of that. And so that's the book of Judges. Judges leaves us looking for a better leader. And then you get to the book of 1 Samuel. So Judges is a cycle of sin and grace. 1 Samuel is a false start. Okay, why is 1 Samuel a false start? What happens in 1 Samuel? What's it? Saul, right? King Saul. And so in 1 Samuel 8:5, it says, I'm starting in verse 4, 1 Samuel 8:4, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old. Like, that's just mean. Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. But this thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of all the people I'm so tongue-tied. Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. And so they will pick a king like they want. They want to live, they don't want to live under God's rule. They want to pick a king like the nations have. And then you get, so God grants their request. They pick Saul, and it doesn't go well. In 1 Samuel 15:23, God is rejecting Saul. He has this stuff going on with the Amalekites. He disobeys God. God had commanded him to wipe out the Amalekites, and he doesn't do it. And Samuel comes and he says, did you do it? And Saul says, yes, we did it. And then there's this thing in there. He says, then what is the sound of sheep I hear? Verse 21, but the people took the spoil, the sheep and the oxen, the best of the things down to destruction. And he didn't kill Agag, the king. And so God says in 15:23 to Saul, for rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is an iniquity and an idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king. And so Saul is rejected from being king because he doesn't have a heart for God. He disobeyed God here. He disobeyed God before in trying to offer his own sacrifices. And so 1 Samuel is the story of a false start. And then you get to 2 Samuel and you have the good start. You have the story of David. And that actually begins in 1:16. David is anointed king, but really you have in 2 Samuel the rule of David. And David is called a man after God's own heart. God promises to fulfill his promises in David. In 2 Samuel 7:26, you have promises made to David. This is called, if you like big words, it's the Davidic covenant. So in 2 Samuel 7, chapter 12, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12, it says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And so who's he talking about here? Jesus? Does Jesus build a house for God? Yeah, he's actually talking about both. Okay, and there are several places this happens where it's both talking of a specific person and yet messianic at the same time, because it is Solomon that will come and build a house for God, but yet Solomon isn't the king that will rule forever. And so you have promises made to both here. And so God makes his covenant with David and promises, and you jump down to verse 16, and your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words and in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. And so God makes the promise to David that that you will have a descendant that will come and his kingdom will last forever. And so since you know the Bible a little bit, so David's going to come, Solomon's going to come, it's going to be a golden era, but then the kingdom's going to split. And so the people are going to end up going, okay, but where's that king? Where's that one that is supposed to come? And so you have in 1 Kings 1 through 11. So I want to make sure you're getting the flow. So we got Judges, right? That's the cycle of sin and grace. 1 Samuel is the false start. 2 Samuel is the good start with David. In 1 Kings 1 through 11, you have Solomon in the golden age. So under Solomon, there is security, there is prosperity, the temple is built, life is good. They are God's people. In 1 Kings 4:20, it says, Judah and Israel were as many as the sand of the sea. They ate and drank and were happy. Like this, if you could pick any time to live, this might be the time and place you wanted to live, because it was amazing. They're in God's place. 1 Kings 4:21, Solomon rules over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. They're enjoying God's rule and blessing. 1 Kings 4:25, and Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba, and they were a blessing to all the nations. You know, the Queen of Sheba comes to talk to Solomon, to get wisdom from Solomon, and so other nations are coming, and they're just enjoying Israel. And their worship is on display as they obey God. And then from 1 Kings chapter 12, so 1 Kings chapter 1 through 11 is the golden age. And then beginning in 1 Kings chapter 12 through the end of 2 Kings 25, you have disobedience, division, and decline. Disobedience, division, and decline. So after Solomon comes his son Rehoboam. The kingdom is split. Israel is the northern kingdom. It turns very quickly from God, has evil kings, and Assyria conquers them in 722 BC. Judah will have some good kings, but in the overall general direction of their kingdom is down and away from God, and they are conquered. But who conquers Judah? Babylon. Yep, and that's in 586 BC. And so we just went from Genesis to the end of 2 Kings. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles retells 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, but from a priest's perspective. So 1st and 2nd Chronicles, you get the same stories, but you get a little bit different perspective on that. So from Genesis to the end of 2nd Kings, you have the, what's the first P word we use? It's not the perfect kingdom, that's the end. The pattern of the kingdom, thank you. The pattern of the kingdom. And then we saw the perished kingdom as sin entered into the world in Genesis chapter 3. And then we saw the promised kingdom, Genesis chapter 12. And then through the rest there, we see the partial fulfillment as God makes promises to Abraham and fulfills them. They end up in Canaan with God's law, living and being blessed, enjoying that. So they're God's people in God's place, enjoying his blessing with a king that has a heart after God, but it doesn't last. And so we see a partial fulfillment. We get a glimpse of what it is like to live under God's rule, but that too is going to fall apart and then leave us going, okay, but when does the king come? Except we know. But if you're reading from just the Bible for the first time, you're left going, okay, how does this happen? Okay? So, that was the partial kingdom. Any questions? All right. What he said, doesn't seem like there's much difference between then and now. The heart of people is still sinful and selfish. Yes. Yeah. All right, let me pray, and you're only 1 minute late. So, all right, let's pray. God, we thank you for your faithfulness, God. We thank you for how you keep your promises, Lord, and we are so grateful that we know how the story ends. We know who the King is in Jesus Christ, Lord, and we know that he is ruling. And God, we look so forward to the day when that rule is obvious and evident to all, God. And so, Lord, we just look forward to your return. It's in your Son's name we pray. Amen.